You can tell a lot about a person by what they do with land nobody wants. Most people walk past it. Dead ground, they call it, the kind of dirt that cracks like old pottery that swallows rain without a thank you and gives back nothing but dust in your teeth. I've ranched 40 years next to a woman who looked at that same ground and saw something none of us could. Not hope, exactly. Hope's too soft a word for what she had. It was closer to a grudge, a quiet, stubborn refusal to agree with the desert about what it was allowed to become. I didn't understand her. I want to say that plainly up front, because most people telling a story like this pretend they were on her side from the start. I wasn't. I thought she was a fool, and I said so more than once, leaning on the fence with a coffee going cold in my hand, while she knelt in ground I'd have written off before breakfast. This is the story of how she was right and I was wrong, and how being right nearly cost her everything before it made a stranger $15 million. Stay with me, it doesn't go the way you think. The first time I saw Nadia Ose on her knees in the dirt, I thought somebody had died. That's the honest truth of it. It was the summer the Talani wash went dry 3 months early, and grief was the only reason I could imagine for a woman kneeling like that in the open sun at 10 in the morning, the heat already coming off the flats in those wet, shimmering sheets that make the fence posts wobble like they're underwater. My old man used to call that shimmer the devil breathing. I was hauling a busted pump motor back from the co-op, and I slowed the truck because that's what you do out here. You slow down for a person on their knees. She wasn't crying. She had a trowel in one hand and a plastic sleeve of something in the other, and she was pressing a seedling, a thin, sorry-looking thing, maybe 8 inches of green, into a hole she dug in ground that hadn't grown anything but tumbleweed and regret since before I was born. I sat there with the engine running. She looked up at me. Dust on her cheekbones, a red bandana gone brown at the edges, and eyes that took my measure in about a second and a half, and decided I wasn't worth stopping for. "You lost," she said. "No, ma'am, I killed the engine, which I don't know why I did. You are, though, nothing grows there." She went back to the seedling, patted the dirt around it with both hands, the way you'd tuck a child in. "That's what everybody keeps telling me. I should introduce myself, since I'm going to be your eyes for this whole thing. Name's Emmett Cole. I ran cattle on the parcel just north of hers, land my grandfather bought for almost nothing in 1961 because almost nothing was what it was worth. I'm the kind of man who keeps a log. Have since I was 12. Little green ledger books, one a year, where I write down the weather and the calves and the price of feed, and every so often a line about something I can't explain. My wife, before she passed, used to tease me that I'd write down my own funeral if they'd let me hold the pen. She wasn't wrong. I'm writing this now because some things you have to get down before they go soft in the memory and turn into a nicer story than the true one. The true one starts with me being a jackass to a woman planting trees. "You from the university?" I asked her. "We got them sometimes, earnest young people with clipboards and soil testing kits, come to study our dying valley like it was a patient they could chart but not cure." "No. Government." "No." She sat back on her heels and finally gave me the whole of her attention, and I saw she was older than I'd first thought, 40s maybe, with the kind of face that's been outdoors its whole life. There were calluses on her hands that a clipboard doesn't give you. "I bought the old Merrick place, the 40 acres. She nodded east, toward the worst of it, the alkali flats where even the mesquite gave up. "I'm going to grow a forest." I laughed. God forgive me, I laughed right in her face. "Here's what you have to understand about that land, and I'll try to make you feel it the way we felt it. The Merrick place was the joke of the whole valley. Ansel Merrick had tried cotton there in the 50s and gone broke. His son tried alfalfa and gone broke faster. The water table had dropped 40 feet in my lifetime, sucked down by every almond operation and golf course between here and the interstate, and what was left in the ground was so full of salt that the few things that sprouted came up looking poisoned, all yellow and curled. You could stand in the middle of that 40 acres and turn a full circle and see nothing taller than your ankle. It wasn't just poor land. It was land that had been given every chance and refused all of them. Dust and hardpan, and a white crust of salt that glittered mean in the afternoon light. And this woman was going to grow a forest on it, with a trowel. "How many trees you figure a forest is?" I asked her, still grinning. 40,000, she said, "give or take." I stopped grinning. I didn't see her again for 2 weeks, and I'm ashamed to say I told the story of her at the co-op like it was comedy. Woman out at the Merrick place fixing to grow 40,000 trees. Got herself a trowel and a dream. Del Ramos about fell off his stool. Even the young cashier laughed, and she's usually too busy with her phone to hear a word any of us say. That's the thing about a dying place. The people in it get real protective of the dying. You start to think that anybody who believes in more than what you've got is calling you a coward for having stopped believing yourself. So we laughed at her because it was easier than the other thing, which was to feel the small, hot shame of a stranger showing up with more fight in her than we had left. When I did see her again, it was because her truck was stuck. Late June, the monsoon had teased us with one real gully washer and then gone quiet, the way it does, and the wash roads had turned to that treacherous chocolate soup that looks solid and isn't. I was coming back from checking a stretch of fence when I saw her old Ford buried to the axle, back wheels spinning, throwing up rooster tails of red mud. She wasn't panicking. She was out in it, in mud to her shins, wedging flat rocks under the tires by hand, and there was a system to it, a patient competence that made me pull over without being asked. We didn't talk much while we worked. I ran a strap from my hitch to her frame, and she gunned it, and I pulled, and the Ford came free with a sound like the earth giving up a boot. When it was done, she stood there breathing hard, mud to her elbows, and she looked at me with something that wasn't quite gratitude but was in the neighborhood. "You want coffee," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've been dying to ask me things for 2 weeks. I can see it on you." So I followed her back to the Merrick place, and that's where the story really opens up, because that's where I saw what she'd done. She'd dug basins. I want to describe this right because it's the first moment the joke started dying in my mouth. Across maybe 2 acres nearest her trailer, the flat dead ground had been carved into a pattern, shallow crescents and half-moons, each one maybe 6 feet across, dug on the contour so gently you'd miss it if you didn't know to look. Little earthen lips on the downhill side, and in each basin mulch, not store-bought bark. Real mulch, wood chips and cardboard, and what looked like the guts of 100 bales of straw, all laid down thick and dark and damp. And in the center of each basin green, not thriving, not yet, but alive, little mesquite and palo verde and desert willow, and things I didn't know, all of them small, but none of them yellow, none of them curled. Alive. "How," I said, "that was all I had." She handed me a tin cup of coffee so strong it could have stripped paint. "You know why nothing grows here, Mr. Cole." "Emmett." "You know why, Emmett. Salt, no water, dead dirt." "The dirt's not dead," she said it flat, like a fact about the weather. "It's starving, there's a difference. Dead you can't fix, starving you can feed." She gestured at the basins with her cup. "Every drop of rain that falls here runs off in about 4 minutes because the ground's so hard it can't drink. So I stop the water, that's all a basin is. It's a place that says to the rain, stay a minute. Water sits, soaks, carries the salt down below the roots instead of leaving it up top to burn everything. The mulch keeps the ground cool so it doesn't cook off. And the mulch feeds the little life, the fungus, the bugs, the things you can't see, and they turn dead dirt back into soil." She took a sip. "It's not magic. It's just patience nobody around here's been willing to spend." I stood in that field of small, green defiances and felt something rearrange itself in my chest. 40 years I'd looked at this valley and seen a thing that was ending. She'd looked at the same ground and seen a thing that was only paused. "Why?" I asked. "Why here? Why this ground of all the ground in the world?" And her face closed up just slightly, a door easing shut. "Because it was cheap," she said, and I knew it was true, and I knew it wasn't the whole of it, and I didn't push. You don't out here. I started coming by. I won't pretend it was noble. I was a lonely old man with a wife 3 years in the ground and cattle that didn't talk back, and here was a person doing something I'd never seen anybody do, and I wanted to watch it work. Or watch it fail. I honestly didn't know which I was rooting for, and that's a thing I'm not proud of. Part of me, the part that had laughed at her at the co-op, needed her to fail. Because if a stranger with a trowel could do what none of us had managed, then all our surrender started to look less like wisdom and more like just giving up. But I helped anyway. My hands were bored and she could use them. I learned the work. It's brutal, I'll tell you. Digging basins in hardpan is like digging in a parking lot. You break a mattock's worth of sweat for one hole. Hauling mulch, she scavenged it from everywhere, from the tree-trimming crews that would otherwise pay to dump it, from the stables, from the co-op's spoiled hay. Hauling mulch in July is a special kind of misery. My back would seize up and she'd hand me a jar of water with a slice of some bitter green thing floating in it and say, "Drink," and I'd drink. And through all of it I got pieces of her, never the whole picture. She parceled herself out slow, the way she watered, a little at a time, so it soaked in instead of running off. I learned she'd grown up in a place I'd never heard of and moved through a dozen more. I learned she'd studied something to do with soil, formally, somewhere, and then walked away from it. I learned she had a daughter she didn't talk to, and a way of going quiet and hard around the eyes whenever a certain kind of memory came up, and that she'd been doing some version of this, coaxing life out of ground everyone else had condemned, in 3 states before she came to ours. "You just move on when it's done?" I asked her once. We were sitting in the blue evening after a long day, watching bats work the air over the basins for the mosquitoes the new moisture had brought. "You fix a piece of dead land and then you leave it." "I don't fix it," she said. "I start it. It fixes itself after. That's the whole point. If I have to stay, I did it wrong." She was quiet a while. Staying was never the thing I was good at. I let that sit. Some grief you don't reach for. You just let the other person hold it in the dark next to you. By the end of that first summer, she had 4 acres going and something like 3,000 trees in the ground, and the change was small, but it was real. In the oldest basins, the ones she'd dug in spring, the mesquite had put on a foot of growth and thrown a little shade, and in that shade the ground was a shade darker, and in that darker ground I one day saw an earthworm. I want to tell you about the earthworm, because I don't think I can make you understand otherwise. There are no earthworms in dead desert. There can't be. The ground is too hard, too dry, too salted, too hot. A worm would die in an afternoon. In 40 years on my land, I'd never seen one, not once, and I'd stopped expecting to the way you stop expecting anything from ground you've given up on. But Nadia turned over a forkful of mulch under a 2-year mesquite, and there it was, pink and blind and absurd, curling away from the light. She didn't whoop, she didn't grin. She went very still, and she looked at that worm the way I imagine some people look at a newborn, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a crack in it I'd never heard before. "There you are," she said, just that, like she'd been waiting for it, like it was late. And I understood, standing there, that this was never really about trees for her. The trees were the visible part. The worm was the point, the invisible machinery of a living world coming back on, one small blind creature at a time, in ground that the entire county had agreed was finished. She wasn't planting a forest. She was arguing with death, and the worm was death conceding a point. I looked away because my own eyes had gone hot and I didn't want her to see it. 40 years of watching things end, and here was a thing beginning, and I didn't have any callus grown over the place where that got in. It was that fall the trouble started. The first sign was a truck I didn't know, a clean white pickup, the kind that's never hauled anything heavier than a briefcase, parked at the edge of Nadia's 41 October morning. A man in a pressed shirt was walking her basins with a tablet in his hands, and he wasn't walking them the way she did, careful, watching where he put his feet. He was walking them like a man appraising a house. I didn't go over. I watched from my fence line with a bad feeling I couldn't name. He was there an hour. When he left, Nadia stood alone in her field a long time, not working, just standing, and even from that distance I could read the set of her shoulders as trouble. I found out the rest in pieces over the following weeks, the way I found out everything about her, a little at a time, soaking in slow. The man's name was Devlin Croft. He wasn't from the university, and he wasn't from the government. He was money, the kind of money that has people who have people. And what he'd come to see, out on the deadest 40 acres in the county, was carbon. I didn't understand it at first. Neither did she fully, not the machinery of it. But the shape of it was this. Somewhere in the wider world, the world of men in pressed shirts, they'd started putting a price on the carbon that living land pulls out of the sky and buries in the ground. Every tree Nadia planted, every basin that turned dust back into black living soil, every worm that churned that soil, all of it was, without her ever intending it, pulling carbon down out of the air and locking it away. And that, it turned out, was worth money. Real money. To companies who'd made too much of the bad kind of carbon and needed to buy their way even. Credits, they called them. Croft had done the math on what 40 acres of restored desert could be worth, planted out full and certified, and sold as offsets over 30 years. $15 million. She told me the number sitting on her trailer step, turning a tin cup around and around in her hands, and I remember the exact quality of the light because I've never forgotten anything about that evening. Long and gold and getting cold at the edges. The first cool evening of the year. 15 million, I said. The number didn't fit in my mouth. For the dirt. For what the dirt does. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her basins, at the small trees throwing their small shadows in the low sun. He wants to buy it, all of it. The land, the trees, the rights to what they'll pull down over the next 30 years. Her thumb worried the rim of the cup. He said I could stay on, manage it, salary and everything. He was very generous. He kept using that word, generous. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that much by then. It's more money than I've seen in my life, she said. More than I'll ever see again. She finally looked at me, and her eyes were doing something complicated, something I couldn't read all the way to the bottom of. It would let me do this on 10 more places, 100 more. Do you understand what I could do with $15 million, Emmett? The amount of dead ground I could bring back. So say yes, I said, when it was clear she wanted me to say something. And she looked back out at her trees, and she was quiet for so long that the light went from gold to gray, and when she finally spoke her voice was very small. I know what men like him do to a thing once they own it, she said. I've watched it happen my whole life. She didn't explain. She got up and went inside, and I sat alone on the step a while in the cold, looking at $15 million worth of trees she'd grown with a trowel out of ground nobody wanted. And I understood for the first time that the story wasn't about whether the desert would let her win. It was about whether the world would let her keep it. The offer got worse the way weather gets worse. No single moment you could point to. Just a slow lowering of the light until you looked up and the whole sky had gone the color of a bruise. Croft came back in November, then again the week after. Then his people started coming, which is how you know money's decided it wants a thing. It stops showing up itself and sends the ones it pays to be patient for it. A woman with a leather folder and a smile that never touched anything above her mouth. A young man in boots that had never been dirty, who walked Nadia's basins measuring things with a laser and writing numbers I couldn't see. They were always polite. That was the part that got under my skin. There's a kind of politeness that's really just a countdown. I was there for more of it than I had any business being. I'd taken to coming by most mornings, telling myself it was the work, the basins that always needed digging, the mulch that always needed hauling. But the truth is I'd gotten to where I couldn't stand the thought of her facing those press shirt people alone. My wife used to say I collected strays, that I couldn't drive past a thing in trouble without stopping. I'd never once thought of Nadia as a stray. But I'd stopped, hadn't I 2 summers back on a dirt road? I'd stopped, and I never quite got going again. You don't have to be here for this, Nadia told me one morning, watching the leather folder woman's car raise dust on the wash road. It's not your fight. Coffee's already made, I said, which wasn't an answer, and she knew it, and she let me stay. Here's the thing they wanted, once you strip the generosity off it. They didn't just want to buy the land. Buying the land was the easy part, the part she could have said no to clean. What they wanted was the future of the land. 30 years of what those trees and that waking soil would pull down out of the sky, measured and certified and turned into paper that other companies would buy so they could keep making the mess Nadia was quietly cleaning up on the far side of the world. Croft would own the credits. He'd sell them at a markup that would turn his $15 million into something a lot bigger over the life of the deal. And Nadia would get her check and a salary and the right to keep working the land she no longer owned, on terms a lawyer in a city she'd never visited would write. It's a good deal, the leather folder woman kept saying. It's honestly a wonderful deal, most people in your position. I know what people in my position do, Nadia said, quiet. She said almost everything quiet, but there were different kinds of it, and I'd learned to tell them apart, and this was the kind with a floor of stone under it. Where's the part about the water? The woman's smile flickered. I'm sorry. The credits are only good as long as the trees are alive, as long as the soil holds the carbon. If the trees die, the carbon goes back up and the paper's worthless. Nadia set her cup down. So somebody has to keep them alive for 30 years, which means somebody has to guarantee the water, which means, sooner or later, somebody drills a well and pumps the aquifer that's already 40 feet down and dropping. She looked at the woman steady. You'd kill this valley's water to keep my trees alive to sell the fact that they're alive. Tell me I've got it wrong. The woman didn't tell her she had it wrong. The woman said she'd have to check with the team on the specifics of the water provisions. And that's the moment I understood Nadia was smarter than every person that money had sent so far, and that money was going to take that personally. I need to tell you about the night she finally told me why. It was December, Cold in the way the desert gets cold, not gentle. Not the soft cold of somewhere with trees to hold the warmth, but a hard, clear, stabbing cold that comes down out of a sky so full of stars it looks overloaded. We'd spent the day wrapping the youngest trees against frost, and we were sitting by the burned barrel outside her trailer, and she'd had 2 fingers of something brown in her tin cup, which I'd never seen her do, and maybe that's why it came out. Or maybe she'd just decided I'd earned it. I've turned it over 100 times, and I still don't know. My father was a farmer, she said out of nothing, staring into the barrel. Not here, doesn't matter where, he had good land. Really good land, black soil you could smell the richness of, land his father broke and his father before that. She turned the cup. A company came, bigger than Croft. They wanted the water under it mostly, there was an aquifer and they had crops that drank money and spat gold, or that's how they sold it. They made my father an offer that his neighbors called generous. She said the word the way you'd handle something that had cut you before. He signed. Everybody signed. It was more money than any of them had ever seen. The fire popped. Somewhere out in the basins, a night bird made a sound. They pumped the aquifer dry in 9 years, she said. The good black soil turned to the kind of ground I fix now. My father's land, his father's before that, I could grow a demonstration plot on it today and charge admission to show people what dead looks like. Her jaw worked. He didn't live to see the worst of it. Small mercy. But I did. I was the one who stood in that dust where the wheat used to come up past my waist, and I made a promise to myself that I have kept in 3 states and I mean to keep here. She finally looked at me, and the firelight was doing terrible things to her face, all shadow and old anger. I do not sell living land to men who see a number where the life is. I bring it back and I hand it to people who'll keep it living, and I move on. That's the whole of me, Emmett. That's the entire recipe. There's nothing underneath it but that promise and a dead man's ruined field. I didn't have anything to say to that. Some things you just hold. So I held it and I threw another board on the fire, and we watched the sparks go up and lose themselves in all those overloaded stars. The trouble, and I mean the real trouble, came because of the daughter. I'd known Nadia had a daughter. She'd let that slip early and gone quiet around it, and I'd never pried. What I didn't know until later was that the daughter, Priya, was sick. Not a cold sick. The long, expensive, grinding kind of sick that our country handles by bankrupting the people it happens to. Nadia had been carrying it silent the whole time I'd known her, wiring money to a coast she couldn't afford to visit, working ground back to life on a shoestring while a hospital fed on everything she made, and then some. $15 million was not, to Nadia, a way to get rich. I want that clear. $15 million was her daughter's life, laid out on Devlin Croft's tablet in a font designed to look reasonable. I found this out the way I found out everything, sideways, and too late to do anything clean about it. There was a phone call I half overheard, Nadia's voice gone to a register I'd never heard from her, all the stone knocked out of it, saying baby and I know and I'm trying into a phone while she stood turned away from me at the edge of the oldest basin. And after, when she'd wiped her face and come back and I'd pretended to be busy with the mulch fork, she said, without me asking, in a voice scraped down to the wood, "He knows about Priya, Croft, his people found out." She laughed, and there was no bottom to it. "That's why the offer went up last week. Did you notice it went up? 17 now. He knows what I need it for, so now it's not an offer anymore. Now it's a," she couldn't find the word. "A trap," I said. "A kindness with a hook in it," she said. "Which is the same thing, only crueler because you're supposed to be grateful." And there it was, the whole thing finally in the open. A woman who'd made a sacred promise over her father's ruined field offered exactly enough money to save her daughter's life if she'd only break it. If she'd only do the one thing she'd sworn on everything never to do, hand living land to a man who saw a number where the life was, and trust him not to pump the valley dry to protect his investment. Say yes, and she saves Priya and maybe kills this valley the way her father's was killed. Betrays the dead man's field to save the living daughter. Say no, and she keeps her promise, and I did not let myself finish that sentence then or now. I did something around then that I'm not sure was right. I've gone back and forth on it for as long as I've been writing these ledgers. I went to see Devlin Croft. I drove 2 hours to the city, and I sat in a lobby with a floor so shined I could see myself frowning up out of it. And I waited a long time, an old rancher in his good shirt among people who checked their watches at me. And eventually a young man came and took me up to a glass room with a view of mountains that Croft, I'd bet, had never once walked in. He was younger than I expected. Pleasant. He had a good handshake and a way of listening that made you feel briefly like the only thing in the world, which is a skill and a dangerous one. "You're the neighbor," he said. "Emmett, she talks about you." That surprised me, and he saw it surprise me and filed it away. You could watch him file things. "What can I do for you, Emmett?" I'd rehearsed a speech. Sitting in that lobby, I'd had a whole speech about the water and the valley and the aquifer 40 feet down and dropping, about what his kind of deal had done to a black soil farm in a place that didn't matter, about a promise made over a ruined field. I'd meant to make him understand. Sitting across from him, I understood there was nothing to make him understand. He understood it all already. That was the thing I hadn't been ready for. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a villain twirling anything. He knew exactly what the water provisions would do. He'd done the math on the aquifer the same as he'd done it on the carbon. It was all just numbers on the same tablet, the living and the dying both, and he'd found the number where it came out ahead, and that was the number he was standing on. "She's not going to sell," I said instead of my speech. "You should know that. You're wasting the pressure." He smiled, not unkindly. "Everybody sells, Emmett. It's just a question of the number. I know about her daughter." He said it gently, which was worse than if he'd said it cruel. "I'm not the bad guy here. I'm the guy who's going to give a sick girl her life back and turn a dead patch of desert into something that helps the whole planet. Your neighbor is standing between a child and the money that saves her over a," he searched, and landed on it like it was a small thing, "a principle about water tables. When she comes around, and she will, she's going to be relieved I was patient." He leaned back. "You should tell her to take it. If you're her friend, that's the friendly thing." I drove home in the dark. 2 hours of empty road and my own headlights, and that sentence sitting in the truck with me the whole way like a hitchhiker I couldn't put out. If you're her friend, that's the friendly thing. Because the terrible part, the part I turned over the whole drive and have turned over since, was that he might have been right. What kind of friend watches a woman refuse the money that saves her child over a promise made to a dead man about dirt? What's a valley's water table against a living girl? I'd have signed. God help me, I know I'd have signed, and I'd have told myself the water would be somebody else's problem for somebody else's grandchildren, and I'd have been glad. I got home near midnight, and I sat in my truck in my own dark yard, and I did not go inside for a long time. I didn't tell her I'd gone. That was cowardice, and I'll name it as cowardice. But I couldn't find the shape of it. I went to your enemy, and he half convinced me you're wrong to fight him. So I said nothing, and the saying nothing sat between us the next few days like a third person at the fire. She knew something was off. Of course she knew. She read ground for a living. She could read a man who'd gone quiet on her. "You think I should take it?" she said finally, not angry, just tired, more tired than I'd ever seen her. We were out at the newest basins, and it had rained in the night, real rain, and the water was sitting in the crescents just like she'd designed it to, soaking down slow instead of running off, carrying the salt down below the roots, and it should have been a good morning. "You've got that look. Everybody gets that look sooner or later. Dell at the co-op's got it. The woman at the bank's got it. Even you now." She wasn't accusing. That was the worst of it. "You think a dead man's field isn't worth a living girl. You think I'm choosing wrong." "I think," I said and stopped, because whatever came next was going to matter, and I owed her the true one. "I think I don't know how you stand it, either way. I think whichever way you choose, you're going to bleed from it the rest of your life, and I don't know how a person picks which wound." I looked at the water sitting sweet in her basins. "And I think if you sell to that man, he'll pump this valley to a bone in 20 years and call it saving the planet the whole time he's doing it. Both those things. I think both those things at once, and they won't sit still in me." She looked at me a long moment. Something in her face eased just slightly, not because I'd solved anything, but I think because I hadn't pretended to. Because I'd handed her the mess instead of a false, neat answer. "That's the truest thing anybody's said to me since he showed up," she said. Then she told me what she'd decided. And it wasn't yes, and it wasn't no, and it was the most dangerous thing she could possibly have chosen. And when she told me the shape of it, my stomach dropped clean through the wet ground. She was going to try to beat him at his own game. "There's more than one buyer for carbon," she said, and there was a flint in her eye I hadn't seen since the earthworm. "He's not the only money in the world. If the credits are worth 15 million to him, they're worth something to somebody who'll take my terms. Somebody who'll write the water into the paper. I don't have to sell the land to sell what the land does. I just have to find the one buyer in the world who'll let me keep the promise and save my girl both." She was already somewhere ahead of me, already moving. I have maybe till spring before Priya's hospital stops being patient and before Croft stops being patient, whichever comes first. I have to find that buyer before either clock runs out. And if there's no such buyer, I asked, if everybody with that kind of money is Croft? The flint went out of her just for a second, and I saw all the way to the bottom of her, and it was frightening down there. How much she stood to lose and how little ground she had to stand on while she gambled it. Then I'll have spent my daughter's last good months chasing a buyer who doesn't exist, she said, instead of taking the money that would have saved her. She turned back to the basins, to the water soaking sweetly down. Don't! I've done that math more nights than you'd believe. Don't do it out loud. The rain started up again, soft. She tipped her face up to it the way she always did, like she was thanking it personally. And I stood in the coming wet next to a woman betting her only child's life on a stranger she hadn't found yet, and I thought about Croft in his glass room saying everybody sells, and for the first time I let myself believe he might be wrong. I just didn't know yet how much it would cost to prove it. Winter is a slow season for the desert, but it turned out to be the fastest of my life. Nadia hunted her buyer the way she did everything, patient on the surface, frantic underneath. The frantic only showing in small tells if you knew where to look. She started keeping the trailer lights on till 2, 3 in the morning. I'd see the yellow square of her window from my place across the wash and know she was in there on a laptop with a signal she had to drive to the ridge to get, writing to people whose names meant nothing to me. Foundations. Funds with earnest words in their titles. A university program. A company in a country I had to find on a map that had decided, for reasons of its own, to spend real money undoing what companies like it had done. She stopped eating right. I noticed because I started bringing food, nothing fancy, a pot of beans, a foil of my late wife's cornbread recipe that I'd finally learned to make halfway to right, and setting it on her step whether she asked or not. She'd get that look, the almost gratitude, and eat standing up over the sink while she talked at me about basis points and verification standards and words I nodded through. The problem, she said one night, cornbread in one hand, is that everybody serious wants what Croft wants. They want to own it. The land, the future, all of it. The ones who'll take my terms don't have the money. The ones who have the money won't take the terms. She set the cornbread down. She'd lost weight. The calluses on her hands stood out harder than ever. It's like the whole world's built so that the only people who can afford to save a thing are the people who'll ruin it in the saving. The 2 clocks ticked. Priya's hospital sent a letter that made Nadia go gray and quiet for a whole day. Croft's people came by less often now, and somehow that was worse. The countdown politeness had become just the countdown, a patient certainty that if they simply waited, the daughter and the hospital and the money would do their work for them. Croft didn't need to pressure her anymore. He just needed February. I did what I could, which wasn't much, and I want to be honest about how little it was because the temptation in a story like this is to make yourself the hero who turns it. I didn't turn anything. I hauled mulch. I brought beans. I drove her to the ridge for signal when her truck's clutch finally went. And I sat in the cab in the cold while she stood out in the wind, holding her laptop up like an offering to the 1 bar of service. And I watched her face in the glow of the screen go up and down with news I couldn't hear. And one afternoon in late January, I did the only real thing I did in the whole business. I went back to the co-op. The same co-op where I'd told the story of her like it was comedy 2 summers before. Woman fixing to grow 40,000 trees. Got herself a trowel and a dream. The same stool, Del Ramos on it, the same cashier older now and no less buried in her phone. And I stood there in the feed smell and the fluorescent hum and I told them the rest of the story. All of it. The basins and the worm and the dead black field in a place that didn't matter and the daughter on the coast. And the man in the glass room who'd pump our valley to bone and call it saving the planet. I don't know exactly what I thought would happen. I think I just couldn't stand being the only one who knew, the only one carrying it. But something did happen, small and slow, the way things do out here. Del knew a man at the water district. The cashier turned out her aunt worked for a legal aid outfit that did environmental work, the kind that has lawyers who'll write hard clauses for free if the cause is right. Somebody who knew a reporter. It wasn't a cavalry. There's no cavalry. But a dying place has more threads in it than you'd think, and I pulled the few I could reach. And I told Nadia none of it because I didn't want to hand her one more hope that might not hold. It came down to a week in February, and I'll tell it the way it happened without dressing it up. Priya took a turn, the bad kind. Nadia got the call on the ridge in the wind, and I watched from the truck as her whole body changed, as the careful, patient woman I'd known for 2 years simply folded, went down onto her knees in the cold dirt of the ridgetop with the laptop still glowing in the frozen grass beside her, and I was out of the cab and across the ground before I'd decided to move. I got down next to her. I didn't say any of the things people say. I just put my old arm around her and held on while she came apart, out there on the ridge with the whole ruined and reviving valley spread out cold below us. And she shook, and she made a sound I hope to God I never hear again. She flew out that night. I drove her to the airport 2 hours off, her old truck's clutch be damned, and I put her on a plane with cash I pressed into her hand that she was too gone to refuse, and I told her I'd watch the trees. "Water the young ones if it doesn't rain," she said, gripping my arm at the gate, her eyes wrecked. "The ones in the east basins, they're not established, they'll die if," and I said I'd water them, I'd water everyone, go, and she went. Croft's people called her while she was at her daughter's bedside. I know because she told me after, flat emptied out. They called to be supportive, to let her know the offer stood, to gently mention that these situations, medically, they moved fast, and that the paperwork on their end could move fast too if she was ready to let them take this one worry off her plate. A kindness with a hook in it, at her daughter's bedside. I think that phone call is what decided it. Not the way you'd hope, not defiance. The opposite. Sitting in a hospital a country away, holding her sick child's hand, listening to a pleasant voice offer her the girl's life for the price of a promise, I think Nadia Ose decided to sign. She told me over the phone, 3 in the morning my time, her voice a thing with all the load-bearing gone out of it. "I'm going to take it, Emmett." "I can't, she's my daughter. What's a water table? What's a dead man's field? She's my daughter and she's right here and I can save her, and I've been playing a game with the only thing that..." She stopped. "I'm going to call him in the morning. I wanted you to hear it from me. You watch the trees, you should hear it from me." And I sat in my dark kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I understood that this was the true ending, the one the world actually hands out, where the good person is broken across the exact place they're strongest, and there's no worm in the last shovelful, no reprieve, just a woman choosing her child and losing herself, and I could not for the life of me tell her she was wrong. "Whatever you choose," I said, "it's yours to choose, not mine, not his. You save your girl and you let the rest of us carry the water fight without you. You've done more for dead ground than any 10 of us. Go save Priya and don't you dare look back." She was quiet, then she said, "Thank you for the beans," and there was almost a laugh in it, wrecked as it was, and she hung up to go sign her promise away. Except she didn't. Here's where I have to slow down, because this is the part that people don't believe when I tell it. And I don't blame them, because I was there, and I hardly believe it. It was the threads. The small, slow threads a dying place has more of than you'd think. The cashier's aunt at the legal aid outfit, she'd heard the story from the cashier from me, standing in the co-op 2 weeks before. And it turned out that outfit had spent years looking for exactly this. A real, provable, in-the-ground carbon restoration, run by someone who'd refused to sell out the water, that they could hold up as the model for how it ought to be done. They had a funder. Quiet money, patient money, the kind that had decided its whole purpose was to prove the thing Croft said was impossible, that you could pay to bring land back and let the person who brought it back keep it living, write the water into the paper in clauses with teeth. They'd been trying to reach Nadia for a week, but her signal was 1 bar on a ridge, and her clutch was gone, and she was at a hospital bedside a country away, and the message had been sitting in an inbox she hadn't opened because she'd stopped believing there was anything in it worth opening. I'm the one who found it. She'd left me her laptop password to send her photos of the trees so she could look at them from the hospital, so she could see the east basins hadn't died. I was uploading a picture of a 2-year mesquite throwing its small brave shade when I saw the subject line, and I read the message 4 times standing in her cold trailer. And then I drove to the ridge in the middle of the night, and I called a number in a time zone where it was morning, and I woke a woman up, and I said, "You need to call Nadia Ose before she signs something in the next 12 hours that she'll bleed from the rest of her life." They called her in the hospital, her daughter sleeping, the machines doing their patient work. And they offered her the thing that wasn't supposed to exist, enough for Priya's care, and the land stays hers, and the water goes in the paper in clauses that would cost them to break. And she keeps working the ground she woke up and keeps the promise she made over her father's ruined field, all of it, both clocks beaten at once in the last hour before the last hour ran out. She didn't whoop. I heard about it later, and of course she didn't whoop. She went very still, the way she had over the worm, and she looked at her sleeping daughter, and she told me she said the same thing she'd said to that pink, blind, absurd creature in the dirt 2 years before. There you are, like it was late. Croft never got the land. I'd like to tell you he learned something, that there's a scene where he stands in Nadia's basins and feels the wrongness of the arithmetic he lives by. There isn't. He moved on to the next dead 40 acres and the next desperate owner. Men like him always have a next. The last I heard, he'd made his 15 million somewhere else, off someone with no cashier's aunt and no threads to pull and no stubborn old neighbor to drive to a ridge at midnight. That's the part the title doesn't tell you. A billionaire did see $15 million in the dust she planted. He just saw it in different dust, in the end, in some other valley, off some other person who didn't get the phone call in time. I don't say that to make it a happy ending. It isn't one all the way. Somewhere out there is a valley that lost its water because the threads didn't reach it. I think about that valley. I think Nadia thinks about it more. Priya lived. I'll give you that much clean because you've earned it, and so has she. She lived, and she's last I knew well enough to be angry at her mother about ordinary things again, which Nadia says is the finest sound in the world, a healthy daughter's ordinary irritation. They're not all the way mended, the two of them. Years of a mother wiring money instead of coming home leave a mark that money coming home doesn't erase. But Priya came out that first spring after to see the trees. I was there. I watched a young woman walk her mother's basins slow and careful, watching where she put her feet, the exact way Nadia walks them, and I had to go see to something in my truck for a minute so nobody would watch me not cry. The trees are still there. More of them now. The fund let Nadia do what she'd dreamed of doing with Croft's money, only better, only clean. 10 more dead places, then more than 10. She still moves on when a piece is started, still can't stay, still isn't good at it. That part of her the money couldn't fix, and I don't think anything can. But she comes back to our valley more than she goes back to any of the others, and I've decided to believe that means something, and I've decided not to ask her whether it does. I'm old now, older than I was when this started, old enough that the ledgers are getting hard on my hands. I still keep them. Weather and calves and the price of feed, and every so often a line about something I can't explain. There's a worm in the last shovelful, is what I've learned. Not always, not for everybody. There's a valley out there that never got its worm, and I won't pretend otherwise. But sometimes in ground the whole county has agreed is finished, if somebody stubborn enough kneels down in the dust that everyone else drives past, if she feeds the starving thing instead of calling it dead, if the threads reach, if the phone rings in the last hour. Sometimes death concedes a point. I drove past her 40 this morning on my way back from the co-op. Stop the truck the way you do. The trees have thrown real shade now, enough that you have to look twice to remember it was ever the deadest ground in the county, the joke of the whole valley, the place nothing grew. There was a bird in one of the mesquites making a racket about something. The basins had water in them from the night's rain, sitting sweet, soaking down slow, carrying the salt below the roots the way she designed it to before I believed her, back when I laughed in her face.